Perfect. Well, thank you again and welcome everyone to the second meeting of the Tannehill Lane Affordable Housing Project. We are so excited that you're here. We have a full agenda for you and we are going to jump right into today's conversation. We want to share information with you. We also want to hear from you as part of our time this evening. So our presenters today will be Travis Perlman, and he'll be doing a lot of the heavy lifting as it relates to some concepts that have been developed for ideas for what might happen on the site. And then we also have Mandy DeMeo here, both with the Austin Housing Finance Corporation. And she's here to answer questions as well. And again, I'm Sharonda Robinson and part of the project team, and we'll be helping to facilitate tonight's conversation, sharing some information and making sure that you get your questions answered. So you're in for a treat tonight because we are using a tool that we hope, fingers crossed, will provide a more interactive conversation. We really would love to be with you in person and to be able to see your faces and have people raise hands and have all of the conversation and crosstalk that we normally have in these kinds of meetings. But instead, we can't do that. So we wanted to create a way where as long as we go throughout this conversation tonight, that you're able to give us feedback instantaneously. And that tool is called Menti. So you'll see that we're going to ask you to go to on your browser, which could be on your phone or on your tablet or on your computer, and type in menti.com and then enter the code 805-416-78. And you'll be able to follow along for tonight's presentation. And just as importantly, you will also be able to provide us with answers to your questions. If you don't feel comfortable using menti.com, then you can use the chat, which is also an option for you as well. So I want to cover tonight's agenda. And again, just let you know that we're here to share information and also hear from you. I'm going to do a recap of our meeting that we held in March 2nd. We pushed it back because of the winter storm. And so we'll share that information. We'll review the input that we heard from that meeting. And then Travis Perlman will share the example development scenarios. And that really is the bulk of tonight's conversation because the project team has been working to take your feedback and put it into concepts and scenarios that we're going to talk about tonight. And then we'll share at the end of the meeting next steps and ways to engage. And if there's any Q&A or additional conversation. And I see William Grant has a question about Menti. If you could go back to the previous slide and we'll put it in the chat as well. So if we could enter into the chat the www.menti.com and enter the code 805-416-78. And thank you, Heather, for putting that in the chat for us. And thank you, William, for that question. So you'll skip ahead to the next two slides for me. All right, so just a quick overview of what we talked about at our March meeting. I know we've got quite a few more people in tonight's meeting, so we really appreciate you joining us. But we covered the meeting purpose. We talked about the Austin Housing Finance Corporation as an entity that is responsible for creating affordable housing in the city of Austin. We talked about the definition of what affordable housing means, the federal definition, and then how we apply that on a local level. We talked about community housing goals and the plan that was developed by district that AHFC is a steward of to ensure that we're building and creating opportunities for affordable housing throughout the city of Austin. As it relates to this project, we reviewed the project area. We're talking about the tract of land next to Norman Sims Elementary on Tannehill Lane. A brief site description so that we could familiarize ourselves with the project and the site constraints. And then we also reviewed the project timeline and process and the proposed development objectives. And obviously, we talked about ways to engage and even provided an opportunity for a survey after our last meeting in March. So as I mentioned, we are incredibly eager to hear from you. And so we are throughout this process finding ways to engage. And so we collected feedback during our March 2nd meeting. We also, as I mentioned, shared a survey that was out in the world, I guess, out in the public for about 3.5 weeks. And then we also took comments by email and by phone. And so on our next slide, I'm gonna invite um, Mandy and or Travis to help me with this because we want to make sure that we're closing the feedback loop. We want to share with you what we heard from our first conversation. And this came from the dialogue and the interaction that we had in our March 2nd meeting. So we heard that, you know, people are concerned about the increasing lack of affordability, that rents and prices are rising in this neighborhood in particular, and that people who have lived in this community for either generations or have moved here more recently are leaving as a result of that. And the neighborhood is changing. The socioeconomic, racial makeup of this community is changing. We heard an interest in allowing those to return who are indigenous or who grew up in the neighborhood, who were based here originally. And so, and I'll come back to this because I do want Travis to speak about this in the next slide. We also heard a real desire for equity, for people to be able to use this project in particular as a way to develop wealth through home ownership. And so how do we, there was dialogue and conversation about how do we allow for households to develop equity with the kind of approaches to affordable housing that we talked about. We heard that there was importance around preserving trees and green space, in particular what the city's heritage rules require, as heritage tree rules require, and what green space may look like on the site. And then also a desire to ensure that sidewalks and bike lanes were a part of this project. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is where I would love for Travis to jump in, and Mandy as well, if she so chooses. But we want to let you know that as it relates to the project team and how our group has been conceptualizing and thinking about how to be responsive to the concerns and the questions of the community. We wanted to share with you about the implementation of the right to return. And Travis will talk about that. That the project is looking at ways to incentivize home ownership models so that people can build wealth, can build equity in homes. That we want to minimize the removal of protected and heritage trees as part of the development and construction of the project. And of course, construct a new sidewalk along Jackie Robinson as required by our current code. And so Travis, do you want to jump in here on the implementing the right to return? I know that AHFC is actually piloting this process in 2 other projects that are underway right now.
Yeah, thank you, Sharonda. Thank you, everybody, for being with us again tonight. This is Travis Perlman with Austin Housing Finance Corporation, project manager for this project. So as Sharonda mentioned, one of the big themes that came up in the first discussion and some of the subsequent responses to the survey that we put out was a recognition that dramatically rising prices in this area have resulted in the displacement of people with historical ties, generational ties to the area, particularly, as we saw last meeting, persons of color, low-income persons of color. And so there's a strong desire, and there's been a strong desire expressed from both our current council and previous city councils to allow people who've been impacted by displacement, who've been displaced from areas where they once lived, to have the first priority in returning to any affordable housing that the City of Austin funds or creates. And so as we talk about a little bit in a little bit, and we'll get your feedback on, that was one of the things right out the gate that we knew was going to be a priority for this project, and we identified in our original proposed development objectives for this request for proposal solicitation, that we wanted to ensure that that a right to return policy in some form is a requirement of any affordable housing developer that gets awarded a contract to develop this parcel. And we have precedent for that, as Sharonda mentioned. We put out two RFPs last year. We executed development agreements for two projects in District 3 in East Austin, just north of the river. And both of those RFPs required this right to return policy. So we're currently working with those development teams to kind of finalize what that type of the programmatic rules around that, how that's going to be implemented, and we'll use that as a model on this project as well as future projects going forward. And again, as Sharonda put it, another big theme was allowing individuals the ability to build equity, that housing be more than just a place to live, but that it provide opportunity for individuals to build wealth and equity, particularly people that have been disparately impacted by policies from both historically from both city government and federal government. And so we wanted that again, straight out the gate, we kind of knew that was going to be a priority. And if you attended the first meeting, you're also aware that we purchased this site from AHFC in 2018 and made a commitment to them to essentially provide affordable housing that would be available to the employees of AISD that really start close to 80% MFI, and that's typically what we see more in our ownership housing. And so right out the gate, as I mentioned, we identified that as a key development objective of this request for proposal, that at least a portion of this site is developed with some sort of ownership housing. And as we talk a little bit more and go through some of the development examples that we're going to talk about tonight, we'll see a variety of different versions of what that could look like and get your feedback on that this evening.
Thank you, Travis. We just want to make sure that everyone knows how we're taking the input, and it's really helping us to create a better project, a better process for this work that we're doing. And so if you're just joining, welcome. We want to let you know that we're using a tool that will help us to engage a little bit more with you live. It's called Menti. And so if you choose to, you can go to menti.com and use the code 80541678. I just added it to the chat, so you'll have it there. But if you can go back a slide, Jen, so we can show the image, and then go forward one for me. There you go. Thank you. So as Travis mentioned, and what we talked about in our initial conversation earlier this month was that there are several development objectives. And what we're wanting to make sure of is that the development objectives that will go into the RFP, as Travis mentioned, align with the community's priorities. And so we want to stop here as part of this conversation and get your feedback on how you think the development objectives that are listed, and I'll read them because I know that there are a few folks on the phone. So the first development objective for this project is to maximize the number of affordable units. The second development objective is to maximize the number of affordable multi-bedroom units for families. The third development objective is to provide affordable home ownership opportunities for low and moderate to low income households being priced out of the area. I'll reread that one because I didn't do that well. Provide affordable home ownership opportunities for low and moderate income households being priced out of the area. The fourth development objective is prioritize housing for households who've been previously displaced or are at risk of being displaced from the area. And the fifth development objective is to ensure responsible stewardship of city funds. And so we want to hear from you in terms of how you think or how you feel the proposed development objectives, which would be ultimately included in the request for proposal, align with the community priorities. And so again, you can put your information in the chat, or you can use the prompt in menti.com, and we'll give folks a few moments to go to menti.com and enter the code 805-416-78. And we'll see that come up on the screen. So can you hide the image, Jen, so we can take a look at what people are putting in here? We have a yes, thank you. And I also want to thank Jen Ramos and Heather De La Paz, who were the wizards behind the curtain, who were helping make sure that everything runs really well this evening. And we appreciate your contribution to tonight's meeting. Thank you for that. We'll give just a few more moments. And everyone can take a look at and review the responses from community. And then I'll just read from the chat. Pamela Williams says, the objectives sound great. Thank you for your feedback, Pamela. And we'll close this out in about 30 seconds. There's a comment that popped up. Please focus on existing homeowners, especially those of color and low income as well. It could be possible that this project establishes a pathway for existing homeowners to keep and afford their homes. That's interesting. I don't think we've heard that before. So would love to open up dialogue around that. All right. Give it 10 more seconds and then we'll move to the next slide. Oh, you gave us a minute. So we'll have another minute until voting closes. That's fine. I'm curious about this comment about establishing a pathway for people, existing homeowners, to keep and afford their homes. If the person who added that to the conversation, if you could speak to that, I think you can just unmute yourself. I want to make sure we understand what that means.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for acknowledging my comment. So what I mean by that is that perhaps this project, any funding that is created through this project could also provide some sort of assistance to those who can no longer afford any increases in property taxes, or perhaps not necessarily know that property taxes is a topic that the state regulates. However, I hope that this project inspires some sort of ideas, some financial ideas or creative uh, ideas as to how it could help existing homeowners around this project, because as you know, this project is going to be a part of another set of low income homeowners. So I just hope that this project could also uh, lead a way to help homeowners that are existing around this project. And maybe that could set up a new funding initiative to assist those that can't afford. Because what I've heard is that with friends and other family units is that who are current homeowners, their main issue is keeping up with the increases in taxes, and that is a major price out factor that is pushing them away from Austin rather than keeping them. So I hope that by establishing this project in this neighborhood, it could also help those that are existing homeowners currently.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that information, that feedback, and helping me to understand that. And we'll definitely make sure that we think about that as we're moving forward through this discussion. Thank you so much. Um, and I just added to the chat the website for additional background information on the project. Someone asked for that. So we can go to the next slide, please. And so what we also heard from you is that these were the priorities, and we've talked about them a little bit, to allow those displaced to return, to allow households to build equity, to preserve trees and green space, and to provide sidewalks and bike lanes. And we know that we've got more folks that are participating in tonight's conversation. And so we want to give you an opportunity to tell us if there's anything that we missed. If there are any other community priorities that are important that the project team needs to consider. So you'll have an opportunity again in Menti. We'll give you a few moments to think about that and tell us what we've missed, what we're not thinking about, what's important to you, what you value about this neighborhood, the community, and what the project might be able to provide. So anything we missed. And you can also provide your comments in the chat as well. And we'll give it about 30 more seconds. I see a comment from the principal of Norman Sims. Go Trailblazers. Principal Wendy Mills, welcome. We're so glad you're here. And she says, we have a great neighborhood state-of-the-art school on Tannehill Lane. Go Norman Sims. We absolutely did not miss that. That was a given, but we're so glad that you joined us and pointed that out for us. Thank you. There's a question here. You talked about the percentages of units, and can you discuss the number of units proposed? We're going to get to that next. So thank you. Hold just for a moment. We're going to be able to answer your questions or provide information about the different development scenario options. Yes, Ms. Mills is also making sure that we all know that Norman Sims Elementary starts with pre-K 3 and goes through 5th grade with loving and very qualified staff. If I were going back to elementary school, I would go to Norman Sims Elementary. Maybe they'll let me back in. Okay. Any other feedback? All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is where I get to turn it over to Travis Perlman. Thank you all so much for participating and giving us your feedback. We want to make sure that we're capturing what you have to share and what's important to you. This is where you really want to listen in, because the team has been working very hard to compile and develop some examples for what may happen on the site. And so please look at this with a critical eye based on what's important to you and the values and the priorities that we've talked about. And then we will also have discussion after we share this information. So I'll turn it over to Travis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharonda. Yeah, everybody, thanks again for joining us tonight. I'm going to walk us through 4 development examples of development that could reasonably be achieved on the site. These are similar to projects that our department has funded or developed previously within the last several years, both in terms of what the buildings look like on the site, and also in terms of the affordability. And so we're going to walk through these different scenarios and get y'all's feedback on these. As I mentioned in the previous meeting, in terms of the public engagement process, we're looking at the first 2 meetings as really a way to gather feedback, to circle back in the 3rd meeting and kind of summarize, how we intend to include all the feedback received so far in the RFP. The first meeting was really focused on getting feedback on the high-level development objectives. And then we've talked about that a little bit more today, again, just to reconfirm that we're on the right track in that regard. And this meeting today is to, again, show you some examples of what affordable housing development could look like on the site, both from a physical standpoint, but also from a affordability and financial standpoint. Have you look at the different trade-offs associated with these development programs, and provide us some insights on things that maybe you like, things you don't like. Again, hope to take that information, combine it with the information received thus far around the development community priorities, and return into the 3rd meeting with kind of a final package of what we intend to incorporate in the RFP. So these 4 examples go from a range of low density to high density, starting first with the lowest density. So this here is single family standard lot housing. So this is very similar to what you see throughout a good portion of the city. So this is 5,750 square foot lots with single family homes. And with this program, we can get 33 units out of the project. And we modeled all of these programs as 100% affordable, so that you could see relative to one another what the affordable housing subsidy required to fund these different projects. And so a 33 unit project on this site, we estimated would require a total of about $4.5 million city subsidy. So that comes down to about $138,000 per unit. And we've modeled these 33 units restricted to households at 80% MFI. Which is just above $78,000 for a 4-person household. And that's standard, that's the standard MFI that we do for all of our homeownership programs for the most part. It's at 80% MFI. It's a middle ground of where buyers can start to afford, qualify for mortgages. It's basically typically around the lowest point where you can get a reasonable pool of mortgage qualified buyers at lower incomes. Next slide, please. And so as we walk through these different development examples, we're going to look, the tables will stay the same. Each example will have 3 slides. The first slide will be kind of an overhead site plan diagram. That's the one we just looked at. The second slide will be a kind of a 3-dimensional diagram. And the third one will be just pictures of the facades of what these buildings look like on the streets, just to give you a good idea of, again, of what this might look like on this site. And so as you can see, that's the 33 single family ownership units. Next slide, please. And again, this is what that would look like. I would say that these homes probably aren't on standard lots. They look like smaller lot homes. And so the typical single family standard lot is looks slightly bigger than this, but it's a size that you're used to seeing around town quite a bit. Pretty conventional, normal size lot. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second scenario we modeled, this is a step up in density. And again, this is a 100% ownership model. But the difference between this one and the last one is this is mostly detached or mostly attached or semi-attached housing. And so these are duplexes, townhomes, and row homes. And as you can see, the density increased. We're able to get a lot more units on the site. And so the first one, we had 33 units on the standard lot. We're able to get 131 units reserved for families at 80% MFI on this site. And with a total subsidy estimate of a little over 5 million. So if you recall for the last one at 33 units, it was a little bit over 4.5 million. This one's about just shy of $1 million more. And we've basically quadrupled the amount of units, the amount of affordable ownership units that we can put on this site. Next slide, please. And this is, as you can see, the density in terms of these homes. Some of these are zero lot light homes. If you see some of the homes on fronting Tannehill Lane, those look more like a typical 3-story townhome with parking on the bottom. And so you can see there's kind of a wide variation in building topologies in this example. And again, that's similar to what it could look like on the site. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is the first, this is the third example that we modeled. This is the first one that has a mix of both rental and ownership housing. The rental housing is a 4-story of wood frame housing wrapped around a parking garage on about 4 acres, about half the site, and the remaining 4 acres is similar to the last example, semi-attached and attached ownership housing. And so we see in this example, we get a total of 271 affordable units, with 56 of those being the ownership units, the semi-attached and attached ownership units. And the balance of that, I think it's 215 units being the affordable rental units and the apartment structure. And so you see one of the differences in this example is we get deeper affordability, much deeper affordability. That's the big difference in rental and ownership housing. And there's a summary slide at the end of this that we'll go over when we start to get y'all's feedback on these. And I can kind of explain a little bit more about why subsidies vary between rental and ownership, between different types of buildings, and how all that generally works. But you see the total subsidy.
Can I jump in? Because I want to make sure everyone is keeping up with all this good information.
Sure.
And I saw a comment in the chat about wanting to explain the table.
Sure.
A little bit more. So can you walk us through that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the table, thank you, William, for the question. So the table is, so the sum total of all the values in the table represent the 271 total affordable units referenced at the top of the slide. 215 of those units are rental units. So you see those in the far left column under rental. And we've modeled this program with those different values of rental units. So let's take the first row, 39 rental units, and the affordable apartment right there being reserved for households at 30% MFI. 58 rental units in the apartment structure being reserved for households at 50% MFI, and so on. Does that help explain it? Sure.
Yep, I think we're good. Thank you.
And so one of the big things you'll see in this slide, the big difference is the subsidy. So when we were talking about the previous two ownerships, we were looking at subsidies, total subsidies around $4.5 and $5.5 million. We see the subsidy essentially doubling from that to $10.6 million. But we also see the number of units doubling as well on the sites. And in the case of the first example, we see essentially, I don't even know, the amount of units I think would be increasing by 8 or 9-fold, essentially, from the first single family example. Next slide, please. And so this is kind of what those two different, both the apartment structure on the bottom and then the attached townhomes again at the top, again, what those could look like on the site. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the final example we're going to go over this morning before we kind of open it up to get y'all's feedback. So this is 100% rental. This is a multifamily 3-story apartment project with surface parking. We were able to yield 271 total affordable units out of this project. I'm sorry, I think those numbers on that slide are wrong. Could you skip to the next slide, Jen? Yeah, that's it. That's the slide right there. So those are the right numbers. So we're going to use this slide right here because those numbers were for the previous mixed example that we got 271 units. So in this example, again, 100% rental, multifamily, 3-story walk-up apartments with surface parking. We were able to yield 257 units with an estimated total city subsidy of $5.36 million. And again, as I walked you through the chart last time, you can see the different units restricted at different levels of affordability, with the 46 units being reserved for households at 30% MFI, 70 units at 50% MFI, and so on. Next slide, please. And again, this is what that could physically look like on the site. Okay. Next slide, please. So before we go into this question, again, I kind of wanted to walk us through, in a summary level, what we just went through, and some of the trade-offs that we consider. So in terms of ownership, and then also in terms of density, there's some trends that exist. So in general, ownership housing is more expensive than rental housing. In general, less dense housing is more expensive to construct than more dense housing. And so so as we go down to the less dense, we get less, the less dense ownership housing we get, in the first example, we get 33 units of ownership housing affordable for moderate income households for $4.5 million, which is 100, as you can see from the bottom row, about $140,000 in total subsidy per unit. Take that to the extreme of the large multifamily project on the other side. We're looking at $20,000 of city investment per unit. So essentially, you could look at that as we're getting, what would that be, 7 units for the price of 1, if we choose potentially move forward with, if what was developed on this site was a multifamily rental project versus a single family ownership project. And so that's kind of the main trade-off from both total units and a financial perspective. But also, I think one other way to look at them for the way these different examples is in terms of the affordability. So one of the things that we identified as a development priority for this site is ownership housing. And that's because we recognize that this is an area that is historically a community of color that has been impacted by rapid rising housing costs, and that in attempts to ensure that people that have been displaced from this area and that people that are at risk of being displaced have opportunities to stay here and to build wealth. We've identified that at least a portion of this site will be used for ownership housing. What form that takes in terms of whether it's attached or detached, we haven't determined. And right now, I don't think that, just from my point of view, I don't know that we've landed both in this conversation with y'all, but also internally as a department and organization on whether we want to require a certain type of building or not, because that has potential negative implications. But it also, like I said, in terms of affordability, one of the big trade-offs here, as I mentioned, so on the ownership side, it is a wealth building opportunity, and we recognize that. And in that regard, it is unique, and it adds something different and beneficial that rental housing doesn't provide for. On the converse of that, with ownership housing, we can't, it's very difficult. It's incredibly expensive to serve the lowest income individuals in our community that are perhaps the most neediest individuals in our community. And so rental housing is really the path forward for providing housing for extremely low income households, people that work in the service industry. Many of the people that work all around town, hundreds of thousands of people that live and work in this city and commute to this city, that are at 50% MFI and below and can't afford to live in the city, or threatening of being displaced from the city. And so those are the balances as staff and as y'all as a community that I want to make sure that we bring up as we open it up for y'all's feedback on the different development scenarios we discussed tonight.
Thank you, Travis. And I see that we've got a lot of good discussion going on in the chat already, and we will definitely get to that. And we're really opening up the dialogue. We want to take a moment to ask you, what do you or don't you like about the different development examples that Travis just walked through? We've got one that is 100% home ownership, single family. We've got another one that is mixed rental and home ownership. And then we have one that is fully rental. And so those are really, that's my shorthand for the charts and the information that you just shared, Travis. But those are really the three development scenarios that the project team has come up with. And we'd love to hear from you on what you think, what you like and what you don't like. So I feel like we can just start answering questions if we'd like on this, because I know people have got some questions. And so Jen, can you pull down the screen for me? That Minty will be live and we'll check back in on it in a few minutes as well. Let me put myself on here. All right, so I'm going to the chat now, and I need someone to pull the comment from Minty. I probably shouldn't have taken it down first. But there was a question I saw about traffic, a comment about appreciation of the higher density options, but how is traffic, and is there a traffic study that will be a part of this project?
Sure. Yeah, happy to answer that. It's a great question. So there will be, it depends. So if we did a very low density 33 single family homes, there likely would be very minimal if any, sort of traffic analysis that was required per the city code. But really, as we start to cross the threshold of about 200 units, that's really when we start to getting into the more robust traffic studies. And so depending on the proposal that ultimately gets selected to develop the project, they will have to do a traffic study if it's approaching or over 200 units at least. And they will have to mitigate for that traffic in certain ways, and that could take a whole variety of different forms. I would say in general, affordable housing, most of our affordable housing are parked at a less rate than market rate housing. And so in general, there's less vehicles in a market rate development in this development. And so in that regard, it would be relatively less traffic than if this were a market rate development at the same size in this area. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, that was Principal Mills who asked that question.
Yep, it answered my question.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Mhm.
Travis, you made a comment, and it piqued a question for me as well about serving the lowest income market and rental housing being the best vehicle for that. Could
Sure.
you, Alexandria Anderson has a question. Why is it hard to serve that population through ownership? And why can't the city help with that? It starts somewhere.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, and I think it's really important to try and wrap our heads around this as we make the decisions about trade-offs, because that's really what they are at the end of the day, are trade-offs. Is what are your values, and how would you like to see them reflected into the development of this site? It comes down to really two things of why ownership housing is really 4 to 5 times more expensive to build per unit in terms of city subsidy than rental housing. And those two things are density and lack of public subsidy. And so on a density perspective, unless it's a high density condo development, which, Mandy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if we have a single high density affordable condo development that we've developed in at least the last decade. And I think part of the reason is that it's very difficult to build the capital, put together the financing to make that deal possible. And so what you typically see, the ownership projects that we typically finance are lower density, kind of the semi-attached, attached, and single family, small lot single family homes. And so what that means is, say you buy a piece of property for $2 million, if you're only splitting that cost up between 33 units versus 200 units, that means that each house has to pay more for land than each apartment unit, essentially. And so that's one of the reasons why ownership is so expensive. The other reason, like I said, is lack of public subsidy. I would say at least 90% of the rental units that we fund, that our department and our organization funds, are also funded with what's called low-income housing tax credits. And it's a federal program that's administered by the IRS that came out in the mid-'80s. And it is the biggest funder of affordable housing in the country. It's the main thing that drives affordable housing development in the country. And that there's two variations of that. One variation essentially covers about 70% of project costs. And then another variation covers about 35% of project costs. And so those are extremely large subsidies, and the development doesn't have to pay those back. And so those come in essentially as gap financing, in addition to our gap, which makes the gap financing request to the city much lower. And so for, let's say on a 50 let's just run an example here on the ones that we looked at. So on the high density project with the structured parking of 250 units, that would probably be in the ballpark of maybe a $50 million project total. If we were to finance that with a 4% tax credit, which would probably be the mechanism that would be used to finance it, those tax credits would essentially contribute about $18 million of equity to the project that doesn't have to be paid back. And so that is a huge difference between the rental and the ownership, is we have $18 million of equity coming in that doesn't have to be paid back versus no equity coming in on the ownership side. And those are the two main differences.
Thank you for that, Travis. And so what I heard was that the land cost divided amongst a smaller number of units, so density is what makes it more difficult, right? And you can do more. If you have more units, then you can serve more people. You can house more people using the incentives that you get for this type of work. And that there's also been a policy decision, honestly, that's been made about how we fund the housing and the type of housing that we fund. And I think that gets to a couple of other questions that you answered around, who's funding the city subsidies for single family housing, and are there federal and state funds putting in money to help the city? And so I think you answered that question. But Mandy, did you want to speak to the affordability piece? Because I think that's where this question from Alexandria is coming from, related to ensuring that there's a pathway for home ownership for low income residents.
Hi, Shrine. Can I chime in real quick?
Sure. Oh, sure.
So my thing is, I'm a homeowner. When I bought my house, my partner and I bought our house, we had to put 20% or more down. The way that the market is rising and growing here in Austin, let's just be honest, let's be real. Like it's not, you're gonna have to spend over like $600,000 plus to own a house, especially here in the East Side, especially in 78721. If we're looking to empower people and we're looking them to give an opportunity to ownership, even if whatever this may be, land trust or full ownership, and giving them a pathway, rental is not going to do it, because I'm going to be constantly paying. That's why I went to ownership, because I'm like, I'm not going to pay someone else's bills when I can have the opportunity to build my equity, build my funding, and do that through ownership. So my thing is, I guess I hope it's better explanation or chime in to see as far as why I know for me and some of my other neighbors where we're adamant and we want people to have that opportunity to have that for their families.
Yeah. And we heard that, this is Mandy DeMeo with the Housing and Planning Department. And we heard that loud and clear in the first community engagement session that we had, really the desire for some sort of wealth building, equity building, homeownership opportunities for low and moderate income people. And that from a homeownership perspective, that's what our department focuses on, is low, moderate income folks at or below 80% median family income. The challenge, we just wanted to be really clear, and Travis did a great job kind of laying out all of the different trade-offs that, are in front of us, really, because that's what this is going to be as we move forward with the disposition of this land, is what trade-offs are we willing to make? Because we can't get everything that we want out of this particular parcel, and we can't solve every single problem. But one of the challenges we find with homeownership is we're not able to serve low income people with homeownership, because homeownership is dependent, as you mentioned, on things like a down payment and traditional financing. You have to qualify for a mortgage. And oftentimes that's a challenge for folks in the lower or even low moderate income levels. And so one of the values that I see of affordable rental opportunities is we have a lot of programs in our income restricted properties or our affordable properties that are really prepping people, prepping households, families, individuals for home ownership. So you're not paying crazy market prices in your rental property. You're able to perhaps clean up your credit. You're able to perhaps save up for a down payment and then position yourself for an affordable homeownership opportunity, which, as you mentioned, particularly in this zip code, but really all over Austin, is next to impossible to find. And so our department is really trying to make those unicorns, like how can you find an affordable homeownership opportunity, make those a reality. And we do that through several mechanisms, home buyer training. We have a community land trust. I think we talked about that last time. We also offer down payment assistance for low and moderate income first-time home buyers. And somebody had previously asked about how are all of these things funded, and it's a mix. It is federal funding, which we are the recipients of block grants from the federal government, but it's also local funding. We're super fortunate here in the city of Austin that we have a variety of sources. We have a housing trust fund, we have general obligation bonds. We have some resources that go for a range, they subsidize a range of affordable housing, but all for low and moderate income people. So for rental housing, it's housing at or below 50% median family income. And for ownership, it's at or below 80% median family. So that is what we're contemplating on this site. You know, how do we accomplish our mission and make the community values realized on this site? We're trying to do multiple things, and I'm so thrilled that we have the principal from Norman Sims here, because another value really is we bought this site from AISD, and we know that our partners at AISD are struggling with maintaining families in the district, and one of the main reasons is affordability. So if we can help with that, if we can keep families here, especially right next to Norman Sims, we're thrilled to do that. So our goal is to hit as many of these priorities as possible, and I just really appreciate everybody's feedback, and we are hearing it.
Yes, I am. I'm very biased about this one. I do want to give opportunity to as many families as we can, because we heard, just looking at the last 10 years, we've lost probably about, hold on, I don't know if y'all can see me. I'm in the dark. I'm sitting on my patio. But we've lost probably about 200 families. And it's simply because they cannot find a place to stay besides Fort Branch, which is directly across from our campus. And even there, with the charters around us, there's a charter directly on the backside of that land. They have taken about 100 of our kids. So they need housing options and they need better school options, which we now have. I'm very proud to say that we have this new building, but it was built for 545 kids and we have 250 there. So there's so much room and opportunity to grow. And I just hate seeing our generational families saying, I went to Norman, I went to Sims, but we got to go. We got to go to Maynard. We got to go to Del Valle. We have to go to Pflugerville. And they're going there and renting, most of them still. So why not, give them an opportunity to rent here? That's the only reason I'm saying I hope that there's a dual option, if nothing else. Otherwise, those 33 families who get those lots better be our families. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you so much. I see your hand, Mr. Grant. Thank you, Principal Mills. I want to make sure we're getting through some of the questions here. So there was a question about the application process. And then there was also a question about whether or not the units would be land trust or fully owned. And so I'm hoping that we can get through those pretty quickly. We've got maybe 5 or 6 more questions.
Yeah, so application process is basically, so on the rent, if an apartment in some form is developed on this property that we fund, it would be, the application process would be like a normal, just like any apartment you go around town. You either call or go into the leasing office for the property manager. and you apply to rent a place. Not really any different, except for the difference being that there's income limits. You have to be income qualified, and that there's rent limits as long as you income qualify.
And Travis, can I jump in? I'm sorry. I also want to, as we discussed previously, we would require, as part of anybody developing on the site, a right to return policy. So it really is about affirmatively marketing. I think in both meetings, we have heard, and we've heard throughout the community, Central East, Eastern Crescent, about folks being displaced. So we want whoever is going to be developing this property to work with us cooperatively and work with the community cooperatively to be able to reach out to folks who have been displaced and want to come back to Central East Austin.
So we have another question, and this was entered into Menti. Do any of these plans require bond votes from all of Austin? So this site is what is being proposed for development on this site require a bond vote for dollars?
Not intended to, as presently contemplated. I mean, essentially, we spend a variety of funds to finance affordable housing, both federal and local sources. So we get annual allocation of block grant funds from the federal government that we spend, and we also have had a variety of different local funds passed through general obligation bonds, 3 different series since 2006, with the most recent being passed in 2018. A total of $250 million, and Mandy's gonna have a much better idea of what we have left in that $250 million, but it's likely that if there was still a gap that the city needed to come in and fund, that it would be funded either through either those local or federal funds.
Yeah, absolutely, Travis. And those funds have already been approved by the voters. So we would not anticipate our timing with this project. If any city subsidy is required, and basically in all of the scenarios that Travis laid out, there would be some sort of subsidy required. It would be based on funding that had already been approved by voters or funding that potentially was coming in from the federal government through a block grant. But I do not anticipate any voter approval in any way for this particular parcel.
Thank you so much for your response to that question. I'm going back to Menti to ask another question, and this is going to require maybe a little bit of data crunching, or I'm betting that you already know the answer to this, but how many units do we, meaning Austin, need for the 80% MFI? Do we have a number for like the whole community?
So we do. And that's going to test my memory. But so we have a thing that was adopted by City Council called the Strategic Housing Blueprint that lays out our goals for housing, including affordable housing, over the next 10 years. It was adopted in 2017, so it goes from 2017 to 2027. And what it says is we need 135,000 more housing units in the city of Austin at various income levels. Those income levels include very low income, which is really, those are the hardest units to create. And I know, Travis, we talked about that when we talked about different scenarios, but those 30% and below income levels. And Sharonda, thank you for posting the blueprint in the chat. We also need the 30 to 60% units, and then we have 60 to 80% units. And so those below market units, we need 60,000. So 6,000 more units a year to serve that income level based on projected job growth at various income levels. It's a heavy lift. This particular parcel would be part of that lift. We have a variety of projects that are occurring across the city of Austin, some of which are subsidized, some of which are not subsidized, that are income restricted. Right now in the city of Austin, we have almost 27,000 income restricted units. This, whatever comes out of this development, would be adding to that inventory.
Thank you, Mandy. We have a few questions in the chat. I'll go back to the chat around who we're paying rent to. So if we're doing the rental properties, who do those rental payments go to? I'm assuming to the owner of the property.
Yeah, so we would be, as Travis mentioned, we've already entered into development agreements with 2 different partners for the 2 parcels that we put out last year. And so they'll be developing affordable housing. One of them is 100% rental, and one is a mix of rental and ownership. In terms of the rental payments, just like a regular apartment complex, you would be paying your rent, which would be reduced rent because it's income restricted. So the rent, there are rent limits that you cannot exceed that we publish every year. There are also income limits for folks who are living there that you cannot exceed as a developer, but you pay your rent to the developer every month, just like a regular apartment complex. Now, we would require that all of these apartment units, that the developers accept housing choice vouchers, formerly known as Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So that would be a requirement as well. And in that case, you pay a portion of your income and the federal government pays the difference.
And that came from William Grant. Did you have a follow on, William?
If I have the opportunity, yeah, that'd be great. Is there a, thank you. Is there a process to deal with sort of the local provenance of the developers and all that sort of stuff for who is developing these units and who's receiving that rental?
Absolutely. And Travis, I think we're going to go over the process for selecting the developer. We have a process internally. So, and I'm going to let Travis go over the process, but we vet the developers, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit. They go through the same vetting process to look at previous developments, checking references, things like that. And this time in this solicitation, there is going to be an opportunity for some community feedback that I know Travis is going to address.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me about that. And we talked about that a little bit in the first meeting when we went over kind of the proposed process and timeline. But William, I want to make sure that we get your question answered. Was your question focused around whether there's just a general process for evaluating the capabilities of developers, or was your question more?
I'll be more explicit about it.
Local developers.
I'll be more explicit about it. Local developers would be very, very nice. It would also be nice if it was people of color, BIPOC folk, that sort of.
Sure. I could say there's a couple of different ways conceptually that we could potentially work that into a solicitation. I can tell you what we did on the last 2 that we put out last year. Is essentially we'll have a section, an evaluation criteria dedicated towards the development team that makes up a substantial point, make a substantial portion of the points. And in that evaluation, we'll be evaluating a variety of criteria. But I think one of the main things that we, I think both as public, but also as staff evaluating it, one of the big things that we'll look at is when we evaluate proposals that are local, I think in general, that's looked upon as more favorably than, and apples to apples, all things being equal, it's looked on more favorably because primarily exactly because they have experience working here. Our land development code is extremely difficult to work around. So having developers come from out of town that may not have that experience, there's definitely an advantage to having people that have developed successful projects in this market and with this land development code. So I can tell you that's something as a evaluation team that we looked at last time as part of that, scoring that criteria, and we would apply that same rule here. And in regards to the process, one of the things that we're proposing doing a little bit different this time around than last time around, and hasn't been ironed out completely, and perhaps we can speak about that in somewhat more detail in the third and final meeting, is we'd like to provide an opportunity for y'all, for the public, to provide an evaluation of the proposals that we received in addition to the staff evaluation. So our intent is to open up a period of time in which the public can evaluate the proposals received, and that information is provided to City Council along with the staff evaluation, so the City Council has a more context-sensitive scoring of how the community viewed proposals and scored proposals versus how staff viewed them. I think that's really important, and I think the last RFPs that we put out last year showed us that there would be real value in providing that opportunity. Go ahead, William.
Can I have one more follow-up?
Well, you had one more question about the retaining owner, not the AISD staff commitments.
I did. I had lots of questions. I'm sorry.
So pick one, because we got about 15 minutes and I've got 4 other people.
I'll prioritize AISD if I'm going to prioritize. Yeah. The AISD question would be more important to me. How do these various plans relate to the 120 MFI commitment that was made to AISD staff and employees?
And so all of the, when we go to put together the proposal, we will require certain levels of affordability, and I can guarantee you that will be 20. So the restrictive covenant that exists on the property that when AISD sold the property, we signed, and it runs with the property, required, as you point out, 25%. It's to be 25% of the units reserved for households earning at or below 120% MFI. All the development concepts that we walked through met that criteria, obviously 100% of them. And so I can't say exactly at this point what that minimum threshold would be in terms of what a minimum, proposal that could be, what a minimum amount would be for it to be considered as a competitive proposal. But that would certainly be the guide, at least that. And I can tell you we'll be looking for significantly more affordability than that on this side.
Thank you so much. And William, if you want to put your additional questions in the chat, we're putting together FAQs. So we'll work to get your question answered. I want to move on to Sanders Renee, who asks the question, will efforts be made to reach out to the displaced families first or priority application? Mandy, I see you've come off mute, so I think.
Yeah, I did come off mute, and we're still working out the details. But we have presented to City Council what we anticipate to be a pilot program for what we call our right to return policy. So it does include both of those. It includes reaching out to displaced families, but prioritizing those applications. So we're looking with our communications team right now at how strategies for reaching folks who have been displaced, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. We have a lot of folks, and I believe Principal Mills had mentioned, folks moving to Pflugerville, and we have folks who used to live in Austin and they may work in Austin, and we certainly have folks who work at Norman Sims who are in need of affordable housing. And so we'd really like to prioritize, make sure that we're leveraging our dollars so that whatever gets developed on that site will actually serve people from the neighborhood, serve people who are working at Norman Sims, create additional families to feed into Norman Sims, and align with our preference policy pilot. But we are depending on our our development partners to also develop strategies for reaching those who are really hard to reach. We're not looking at the standard, I'm putting an ad on Zillow, or I'm putting at apartments.com. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for affirmative marketing to reach communities of color, people who have been displaced, low and moderate income families, and that will certainly feed into our evaluation criteria.
Thank you, Mandy. So we have a question about these new companies that are coming to Austin, especially tech companies. How are we involving all these new companies in Austin so that they can help out in funding affordable housing? If they are not involved, and I'm not going to yell, but it's all in caps, they should be. Who wants to help respond to that?
I will dabble in a response. So that's the caveat. We have been working for years with folks in the business community to prioritize affordability. It's a challenge. A lot of new companies that are coming to Austin view Austin as a really affordable place to live because it's a whole lot more affordable on an absolute scale than Silicon Valley or the Bay Area, or you name it, on either coast. That doesn't do those of us who live in Austin, are from Austin, have lived here generationally. It doesn't do us any good because it really does impact the housing market, as we've seen for the last couple decades, but it has really ratcheted up in recent years, and certainly during the pandemic. We will continue to work with our friends in the business community. They have recently stepped up around the homeless conversation. We've seen a lot of recent major investments in homelessness solutions. We haven't necessarily, other than individual nonprofits, have certainly partnered with a variety of business, local businesses, national businesses. I can think of Foundation Communities as an example. They have received recent major donations from the new, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's the new football club. Austin
FC, that's what
I think that's what it is. I'm sorry, I should know more about that. We have recently received a large donation from Bank of America for our emergency home repair program that came about as a result of Winter Storm Uri. So we are certainly seeing the business community starting to really pay attention to our range of housing problems. And I anticipate that those conversations and dialogues will continue. And I am extremely hopeful that we're going to see the business community get more and more involved in affordability and affordable housing across the spectrum.
May I say something? Oh, I was the one who said who presented that question. Hefte?
Do you have your camera on?
No.
Okay. All
right. I turned it on. Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for answering that question. Yes, I do recognize and I do appreciate that I do appreciate the fact that Silicon Valley or any other geographical areas that were traditionally home to tech companies are much more expensive than Austin, at least now. So I do see these new tech companies as a part of the issue of unaffordability because they're attracting so many people who are looking for cheaper properties compared to California and New York. So these families that have been part of the Austin community for generations are kind of bearing the pressure that uh, these new companies are kind of running away from. So they're passing on the burden to us a bit. So we're paying more because now they're here. And so I would definitely encourage the city of Austin to put a bit more pressure in getting these new companies involved and helping us, especially low incomes and people of color, because if they don't know how much of an impact financially they're causing on us, then I would definitely educate them as much as y'all can, as you've done with the business communities. But I would kind of double up the pressure or just the education aspect of how they can help and strategize with them to help us, because I think that these new companies that are coming in are passing on or passing on financial burdens that we didn't really ask for. So I would definitely commend and encourage the city of Austin to, if Austin alone can't do it, maybe the state of Texas too can be involved in this too. I mean, unaffordable housing is not just an Austin issue. Fort Worth is going through it. Houston is going through it. San Antonio even a bit. So I would definitely push that, or push getting involved, get the companies involved a little bit more. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. I appreciate that comment, and I hear about the focus specifically on high-tech companies, because that's really where we're seeing a lot of economic pressure. And our department is certainly working on that, and appreciate your comments.
And what I appreciate, I think, the most about this conversation is the intentionality around what's important to the community, specifically related to this project in Tannehill Lane, but then also the broader issues, right? And how we might engage in policy conversations around funding and influence, because we're part of this community. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has shown up tonight to weigh in on this conversation, to give us your ideas and feedback on the proposed development alternatives that Travis provided. This is not your only opportunity to provide feedback. We're going to be sharing a survey with you. And so if you want to think a little more about the information that's been shared and provide us with additional feedback, please go to that survey. It's live now, and provide us with any comments, what you like, what you don't like, what you think we should be doing, what we should be focusing on. All of that is in play right now because we're really wanting to ensure that we are including community priorities in the process. So complete the survey. You can also email us at housingdevelopment@austintexas.gov. And then we'll have a third and final community conversation and meeting on the Tannehill Lane project. That meeting is on May 4th. And I believe that is a weekday, so it will be in the evening again. And during that meeting, we will continue this dialogue and share with you where we've landed based on the input we've received, based on the number crunching that the team is doing, based on the different ideas that have arisen to meet the criteria, the development criteria for the project. But I just want to say thank you to Mandy DeMeo. Thank you to Travis Perlman for being here and helping us to guide this conversation. Someone just asked, what's the timeline for breaking ground? We'll make sure we get the word out on that. And we will post this meeting on the project webpage so that you can share that information as well as the previous meeting presentation and materials.
I'm glad you said that. Our families didn't get a lot of notice because of spring break. Yes. But I think they're interested. They just may not have had a chance to get on tonight, but I wanted to either present it at our CAC in some kind of condensed form, just to gather more input, because there's 19 people here. I know there's a lot more voices on our campus than 19, especially my teachers. I do want to give a shout out to Miss Joy Hall, which is one of our second grade teachers. a newer teacher wanting to stay in Austin. She's from Detroit, so she doesn't want to go back to Detroit, I hope. But she wants to be able to not have to live in Buda and Kyle or Hutto, where most of my teachers are driving 45 minutes to get here. And they do it so religiously. I mean, they are committed to our little community. So I want to be able to kind of give them the insight on what this conversation was about and see what their thoughts are as well, so we can add that to the input. So thank y'all for making sure that it's recorded.
Absolutely. And thank you for offering to continue to share
Yep.
what we're doing here, what we're trying to accomplish with your networks. And we ask everyone who's participated tonight and who's watching later to do that as well. This is really an important project, and it really takes all of us
Yep.
in this community to make it happen. So thank you so much again for joining. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you again on May 4th.
Thank you, Norman Sims families who did attend. I see you. Spread the word.
Yes.